Thanks for joining. Thank you and welcome to today's webinar, Building Material Reuse from Whole Buildings to Individual Components. My name is Katie Calusi. I'm the Deputy Director at Illinois Green Alliance, and I'm so excited to have you all here today for one of the Illinois Green Programs Committee special events. Today's program was put on by our Programs Committee, which is a volunteer group that coordinates educational events covering a wide range of topics throughout the year for the green building industry. The team that put on today's event consists of Jason Meyering, Ivana Rose, and Matthaios Aravosis. We're so excited to have them here and all of our speakers today. You've been muted upon entry, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A and we will get them answered at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording and all sorts of great resources. Next slide. At Illinois Green Alliance, just a little bit of a refresher for those of you that are new to us today. We are a membership-driven nonprofit organization that advances green buildings and sustainable communities for all. Our strategic plan pushes the green building industry to meet or get on the path to net zero, and we achieve this work through educational events such as panels and building tours, engaging communities and partnering with organizations across Illinois, and by advocating for new policies and legislation that advance our goals. You can review all of our past webinars in our on-demand webinar library if you get excited after today and want to learn more. You can learn about membership, see upcoming events, and get involved by visiting our website at illinoisgreenalliance.org. Next slide. I wanted to take a moment to recognize Illinois Green Alliance's sustaining sponsors who make our work possible. A special thank you to our gold level sponsors, ComEd, Resource Innovations, Sloan, and USGBC, making a commitment to advancing green buildings and communities across the state through sponsorship. And you can start a conversation today with any of us on the line at Illinois Green. Next. Today, you have some learning objectives. You are all going to learn a lot of great things today from our speakers. And so I'm not going to read them all here, but just wanted to make sure you see some of the learning objectives that our speakers have put together for today's program. They're all really great, and I'm excited to introduce our moderator next to bring our welcome our speakers. Slide. Now let me introduce Matthaios Aravosis, a senior property condition assessor at CBRE and the programs committee lead for this event for Illinois Green. He will be moderating today's program. Matthaios, take it away.
All right, thank you, Katie. We have a phenomenal lineup of speakers today. So I really wanted to thank everyone again for attending. To start off the panel will be Ren Ekman. Ren is the Chief Sustainability Officer at HKS. He has a passion for projects and driving broad-based, measurable change within a profession. He is a member of HKS's ESG team, bringing in firm-wide leadership, advancing sustainability, public interest, design, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. He has a bachelor's in philosophy and a master's in architecture, which he says are indeed very related, even though they may not appear to be. And he's currently on the board of the Health Product Declaration Collaborative and Mindful Materials. He served on the board of the Illinois Green Alliance for many years and has a national AIA and USGBC committee recognition. Patty will be the second speaker. She has almost 20 years of experience advancing sustainability in the built environment. She's an advocate for green building, high energy performing construction, and has served many leadership roles throughout the green building industry, including sitting on the USGBC Technical Committee, the AIA Illinois Board of Directors, and has formerly been on the board member and a chair of the Illinois Green Alliance as well. Patty is a lead fellow, LFA, and has achieved WELL AP accreditation. Our final speaker will be Ann Nicklin. Ann is an architect and educator who has supported the growth of the Rebuilding Exchange into a leading provider of workforce training and deconstruction services. Ann holds a Master of Architecture and a Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. And has previously served as the Executive Director of the Building Materials Reuse Association, which is now Building Reuse. And then with that, I will be passing it off to Rand to begin the panel.
Thank you, Matthaios. Appreciate the introduction. So I've shown this slide in a variety of different presentations. I love it because it just makes me smile. It's also always time to make the world a better place. Today's conversation, I'm going to share a little bit about what I see happening in the industry. I'm going to share an example of addressing materials in a specific project, and then I'm going to share a little bit about what we're doing inside of HKS. HKS is a big firm, so we have a big ship to kind of send in the right direction, and I'm going to sort of share the framing of that effort. Next slide, please. So a few years past, the American Institute of Architects, in concert with a bunch of other organizations, realized that we needed to really double down on the question of materials. And the materials pledge was developed. You can see it's been signed and by many, many different firms, big, small, all influential. It's intending to sort of focus the firm's attention in delivering projects to our clients in a way that is much more deliberate around materials. Next slide. So it's asking us to pledge to support 5 specific areas that materials have a direct impact. The first is human health. The second is climate health. The third is ecosystem health. The fourth is social health and equity. And the last is circular economy. That's much of what the conversation is going to be, at least from my side today. But it's easy to understand how these things are not sort of independent silos. There's an overlap in the Venn diagram for nearly every single one of these. The pledge asks us as firms to continue to ask for transparency in product ingredients and impact, as well as the creation of better products, and to continually to improve and update our internal specifications and procurement processes to require both transparency, documentation, and optimized products. And then to do the kind of thing that is happening today, which is to collaborate and share best practices, tools, and education. So that part's particularly fun for me. Next slide. Out in the world is an organization called Mindful Materials. I would be remiss if I didn't mention this because, as you heard at the beginning, I am on the board. The Mindful Materials is a not-for-profit that is focused on supporting the common materials framework and the industry objective and the 5 buckets that I just introduced. You may have heard of these already. There's lots of detail as you dig down into the buckets, and the role that Mindful Materials plays is a critical role. Next slide. So one of the key things that we are trying to do is to create a common materials language. So we're all speaking the same language, both in terms of the spoken and written word, is also in terms of the sharing of data and the transfer of information. And that all of that information is intended to go through the framework, which is the Common Materials Framework, and then to give actionable information on the five buckets that I've described previously. Next slide. So we've attached ourselves to a whole host of different organizations. It's really trying to reach around the many different sort of corners and places that our industry has, and position Mindful Materials as a collaboration hub for this information. It's a key part of the organization's work right now. And again, it's one of the reasons why I want to introduce this in this call, so that you all know that it's there and would potentially take a little time to go out and check out the material, because I think it's going to enable you to do better work in a more actionable way. Next slide. The 5 buckets have subcategories within each bucket. I'm not going to get into the depth of this, but this is the organizing structure for much of the information that is being created in the common language. Next slide. And this is the next layer of depth sort of showing the one human health top bucket. There's a host of different issues that get sort of resolved or revealed in the data. In human health, it's substances, VOCs, and then the organization, the company, how it is that the company is addressing human health impacts. Those are focused in on another level of detail, which is around transparency, assessment, commitments, and optimization. And then there's data that flows from that is even more refined around factors and subfactors. What is the actual accomplishment or optimization status of that particular material or product? Next. So that was hopefully an intro that whet your appetite to go and spend a little time there. I'm going to focus this next piece of slides on a particular project around circular economy, which is sort of why we're here. This is the statement in the pledge to support a circular economy by reusing buildings and materials and by designing for material efficiency, long life, and perpetual cycling. Next slide. So this is a project that HKS did a few years ago. This is the ProMedica headquarters. It's an adaptive reuse of two buildings. One is a historic Daniel Burnham designed steam plant with the chimneys that you see there, and a brutalist, maybe less remarkable sort of junction building. Both were sited sort of on a park at the Maumee River at the heart of Toledo, Ohio. This Healthcare Institute is a not-for-profit with a mission to improve the community health and well-being. The design for the headquarters aimed to sort of transform the downtown and to reuse the buildings that were existing right there. We did a life cycle assessment to try to understand the delta between building new and reuse. Fortunately, we had the opportunity to really dig into the reuse for this particular project. The chart in the upper right of this slide shows the 2,300 metric tons of embodied carbon if this were a new build, and the 725 metric tons of the adaptive reuse. So that's about a 70% improvement by using the building as it currently exists. Next slide. This is an interior picture. I like to show this, one, because I think it's really a compelling environment, but also because you can see the character and the historic quality of the building as it is currently being reused. So the structure is there, the envelope is there. Windows were reworked, but the envelope was generally sort of left as is. And I particularly like the space that's created here. Next slide. So one of the things about circular economy is, making spaces and places that last, that have longevity. This space has both an interior and an exterior function. There is a park which has lots of events that happen, has really created a vibrant economic place for the community. The urban renewal has affected both the sort of transit patterns as well as the core economy of that part of the city. And as I said before, there was a 70% reduction in the embodied carbon footprint. So that's a project example that I wanted to share. I'm particularly proud of that. We've, we don't always get the ability to sort of say, okay, let's really dive deep into a reuse. There's a project where we did, and we need more. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to sort of spend just a few minutes to talk about what it is that we're focusing in on in HKS and how we're sort of framing the notion of circular economy. This is some graphics and some thoughts that are drawing directly from the London plan for guidance for a circular economy. If you haven't heard of that, I suggest taking a look at that as well. It's got some very useful guiding principles: building in layers, designing out waste, designing for longevity. I had an interesting experience earlier this week where I was fortunate enough to listen to a presentation by Shigeru Ban. And he was talking about how the buildings that he's been doing that are intended to be temporary buildings are ending up having a very long life. And the reason they're having long life is things that are being considered temporary are being appreciated by the users and they're becoming permanent. So that issue of longevity, I think, is a really fascinating issue. Next slide, please. Designing for adaptability or flexibility, reuse, potentially for different program uses, as you saw in the project I just shared. That's a sort of a healthcare office function that was a totally different function, a power plant. Designing for disassembly, how it is that we can potentially use more mechanical fastening systems so that we can take pieces apart and reuse them in different ways in the future. And using systems, elements, and materials that are easily reused, recycled, and ideally upcycled. Next slide. So we've been through a whole host of different discussions about how inside of HKS about how to think through this. This is a chart that we put together to try to think through the elements that I've just went through and how difficult they are to deploy in the delivery of a project, in the creation of a design, and their impact. So we're focused on high impact, ideally low effort, but potentially high effort as well, as the sort of framework for thinking through circular economy in our projects. Next slide. So I wouldn't be doing justice to this topic if I didn't provide a little bit of my own editorial thinking. So I do think this is an area where there's growth right now and there's a lot of opportunity. I do think there are also some challenges and some barriers. We can talk about those at the end of the session as well. So we do have information about how to deploy thinking around and design towards circular economy, but it's not always packaged in a way that's tangible, and design principles are not always built into the workflow that we would hope. Specific examples do exist, as I've shared, but it's still somewhat of a niche topic. There's a new building mentality that I think permeates the industry. Generally, there's a lack of knowledge on how to do this and a lack of information on practical examples and agreed upon principles. I would say that the City of London is a really good example of where that's not the case. But here in the States, I don't find that to be particularly common. And some elements of the circular economy are built into the systems that we use, but it isn't yet, in my estimation, it isn't yet pushing the boundaries that we need to push. So projects are using some of the design principles, but it's not explicitly promoted as much as it probably should be. Market demand is a little bit low, I would say. The approach to work streams in circular economy are driven largely by voluntary requirements by designers and professionals, contractors, and other professionals in this space. But it isn't yet built into regulation and legislation, at least not in North America, and that would be a big help. There's a lack of confidence, in my experience, there's a lack of confidence about the availability of the materials when we need the materials. The marketplace for that isn't always as mature as we might want it to be. And then there's the last piece, which is client perception that new is always better. I'd say that's not just a client perception, that's a design side perception as well. Next slide. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to ask some core questions. What is the impact of the decision? What is the impact of the detail that we're drawing? Is it possible to do it in a different way? Ask ourselves whether we actually need to use new materials. I mean, that's kind of a fundamental thing, but commonly it's not what we've been trained to ask. We need to prioritize reuse and repurposing of what already exists. And we need to focus in on decisions and invite new building spaces, specifications that prioritize. Sorry, I just was reading the question that popped up. Detailing with disassembly. This is a big thing for me inside of our firm. It's an area where I think there's a lot of potential for growth. It is not a typical way to think about how to build details, how to build joints, structural systems, and other systems. Seek ways to use fewer components. Using less is always good. I know it sounds basic, but it's true, and it's not commonly our original position. Make sure that our demolition scope is clear, and we have a plan for what we can use or what we can reuse, how it can be harvested, and how it can be recycled back into the building material stream. And then lastly, educate our clients. That's a key piece, as well as our colleagues, on the value of all these decisions. And in particular, doing some of the studies like I was sharing earlier around the 70% delta between building new and reuse for embodied carbon. And I think that is my last slide. Is that right? Oh, one more. Big statement. It's time for circularity with purpose and vision. It's going to take work. It's going to take commitment. It's going to take signing on to the pledge that I shared at the beginning of this. And I hope this was a bit inspiring, and we'll all go there. Thank you very much. Now we can go to the next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Patty now. I know questions have come up. I think what we decided was we were going to address those at the end so we can make sure we get through all the content. Patty.
Thank you, Rand. Great presentation. I'm completely inspired. Hi, everybody. It's great to see so many names we know and the participants, and I'm tasking you all with taking this message forward as we all advocate for a more circular economy. I'm Patty Lloyd. I'm the Director of Sustainability at Leopardo Companies. We're a general contractor headquartered here in Hoffman Estates, Illinois, and we're working all over the country. Next slide, please. So I'm here really to talk about some of the construction impacts and some of the resources that are out there so that we can all use this knowledge to go forward. The AEC industry has a waste problem. Demolition and construction debris more than double that of municipal solid waste. So this is huge tonnages of material that is going to the landfill or the recycling stream. However, sometimes that's not the highest and best use for materials. Next slide, please. So we have a take, make, waste model. Rand referenced that. So the construction industry is the largest user of natural resources. The built environment generates 40% of global CO2 emissions. And waste generation and management, in 2018, the EPA estimated 600 million tons of CD&D debris were generated in the US. And again, that's more than half of the municipal solid waste. So we have a tremendous opportunity as practitioners in the built environment. Next slide, please. So the construction waste stream. So an FCRBE study found, this was done in Europe, that only 1% of building items were reused. There is economic loss and high environmental cost to this. Heavies, or this is a lot of what we see in demolition, concrete, asphalt, masonry, brick. Heavies account for almost 67.5% of the waste stream from CD&D. 67.5 is concrete and 17.8 is asphalt. So those are items that are, easily put to reuse on site or to be crushed and recycled. Next slide, please. There's no reason they should be in a landfill. Construction growth. The projections are high for construction growth as we continue to build to accommodate a growing population. So between now and 2060 across the world, the equivalent of the city of Paris will be built every week. There's also another like US, there's a US comparison with the city of New York. Over the next 40 years, total building stock is estimated to double. And nearly a third of our present building stock is going to come down through that process. By 2050, we'll consume 3 planets worth of resources. So that doesn't seem like a feasible number. We've only got 1 planet. I don't think we can recycle our way out of this. So how can we reuse and salvage existing materials to do that? Next slide, please. There is a tremendous opportunity to capture value. I saw a question in the chat asking about commercial construction. We need this graph for commercial construction. This was done for the residential market, which has a much higher adoption of deconstruction and salvage of materials than the commercial construction. But you can see of the house, only 5 to 15% of the materials can't be reused or recycled. And the big number to me with what we're talking about today is that up to 25% of materials can be reused. So why aren't we doing that? Next slide, please. And the waste hierarchy has to change. So this is a rethought waste hierarchy. And it was put out by EPA. And I think Cleaner Baltimore has a similar one. But before we start recycling, we need to really rethink, redesign, reduce the amount of materials, as Rand said, and then figure out what we can reuse. You can see the very bottom, the smallest piece of the upside down pyramid is the waste. Next slide, please. So we're really in a linear model right now. We need to go to a circular model. That's why you hear the word circularity. Often when you say circularity, people say to me like, I recycle. Well, that's great. It's just not about recycling, right? And you can see a beautiful circular model here at the bottom. Next slide, please. So there's triple line opportunity for commercial deconstruction. I'm not going to talk about deconstruction a lot because Ann's really got that covered, but we've got environmental, economic, and social. As someone said to me recently, like deconstruction and salvage truly hit all 3 legs of the stool of the triple bottom line. Next slide, please. So building material reuse, there's a ton of different kinds of it. There's adaptive reuse with component reuse. Reusing what's available on site. You can reuse construction materials from elsewhere. You can have secondary use of non-construction materials. There's all kinds of opportunities. This organization here is Build Reuse, and they're a national organization that works with a lot of reuse centers. You might see my awesome Build Reuse t-shirt here today. Next slide, please. This was put together from All for Reuse, which if you haven't checked out their website, you should, but really this slide focuses on the high churn of tenant interior projects. So these projects turn over really fast. And what that means is that you often have a lot of really usable materials that are going to landfill or recycling that have hardly been used. You know, when a ceiling tile's in a commercial interior project, and it get replaced every 3 years, it's essentially not used. It's a brand new. How can you design to keep that in place or donate it or put it to a manufacturer take back program? But anyways, this slide really shares some great points. Demolition waste from commercial renovations is over 20% of the US construction and demolition waste stream. So that's a pretty big number when you're talking not whole buildings, but really interiors. A lot of these materials have high embodied carbon and are widely used and easily reusable. If you like carbon, the best, lowest carbon material you could ever use is a salvage or recovered material. An interior or initial embodied carbon of interior materials, it's a fraction of that of core and shell, but it's appreciable over a lifetime of building renovations. And so you can see, you know, this thing here at the bottom where you have number 2, you've got your core and shell, But then you see it keep repeating and repeating as renovation occurs. And again, material reuse offers 99% or more reduction in embodied carbon. So next slide, please. Here's some example of surplus and salvage from some of our jobs. And I think it's great to like label them in this way. So the top couple pictures, they're projects that we removed during demolition of a project, cleaned and put right back in, as all the ceiling tiles here. We had some items like the chair there, the medical office chair that was salvaged. So it was taken off of a site and donated. And then we had 3 pallets of surplus materials on another project, never been used. And we're able to go to the reuse network. Next slide, please. So there's a huge opportunity for surplus, really kind of a hidden story of the industry that people don't really talk about. This is your attic stock. These are the extras when you have to order a high volume to get a price break. So it's another feedstock into the materials reuse stream. It's not the same thing as salvage materials, purchased and never used. There's materials data available and it's new in box. And the San Francisco Department of the Environment did a great study on this that you can access online to find out more, but they had some great findings. Next slide, please. There's a lot of deconstruction contractor training and educational resources out there. Some are newer, some are older, but there's quite a lot of literature out there. A lot of it is focused on the residential market, but more and more it's really changing to start to look at commercial as we realize that commercial is just a huge nut to crack and has opportunity to have really big environmental benefits. Next slide, please. And then here's some more deconstruction resources. Build Reuse has a national registry of deconstruction trainers. EPA has some materials on their website. Next slide, please. Code language is supporting reuse in new construction. So Washington State and Oregon have both implemented code language to facilitate the reuse of building materials. And this is a big deal. I believe more and more cities are going to start to pick up language like this. Next slide, please. Salvage assessments are really, really important. This is something where if it's coming from the design side or the client's asking for it to be done, that can be really meaningful. You know, you can't manage it if you don't measure it. So if you don't inventory what's in a site, how do you know what to salvage or recover? Next slide, please. Stop Waste has a deconstruction specification that can be used. This is an excellent tool that anybody can download. Next slide, please. Material rescue and reuse epitomizes climate action for the building industry. It honors the embodied carbon and upends the prevailing linear take-make waste pattern. And that is the truth of it. When you're salvaging, you're respecting those harvested materials, you're respecting all the inputs put in to manufacture it the first time. There are a growing number of cities and states that are implementing construction and demolition debris laws, in addition to deconstruction ordinances. Next slide, please. Yeah, I thought I had a slide about deconstruction ordinances. More and more cities are having deconstruction ordinances, and this is a great way that they're achieving their climate action plans or coming to their zero goals. The All for Reuse website has a reuse ecosystem map. You can go in and it is directed by state. And there's a lot of different things you can search for to try to find resources in your areas. I would say that I thought I knew what was going on in our area, and I actually found a couple things that I was not aware of. So it's a great resource to check. Next slide, please. There's a lot of material exchange platforms coming out. We need them all. We need all of these different niches in this space to move materials. One of the biggest issues, and I think Rand alluded to this, is the logistics. Like, okay, if Rand specifies some reused materials, it's quite some time before us as the contractor get that. What happens to those materials in the interim? Who stores them? Where do they go? Furthermore, when we're pulling materials off of jobs, how are we moving them? You know, a lot of times I go to Ann's organization quite a bit, but these materials exchanges are becoming an extremely powerful tool to facilitate materials exchange. Next slide, please. So there's challenges. Schedules and contracts don't value deconstruction and reuse, and they don't reflect the added time or labor that needs to happen sometimes. There's not enough stability to make sure the materials are there when needed. You've got to have some out of the box thinking. You know, if you're specifying materials before the contractor is hired, maybe the owner gets those materials and stores them somewhere. I don't know, but these are things we need to be thinking about. There's inundation of certain commodities, commercial deconstruction and salvage and reuse is talking in large quantities. And most of the places that are out there that are reuse stores don't have the storage space to handle that. So how do we move that? Cheap landfill costs in parts of the country. Somebody said to me, but don't you save money on tipping fees? Not when the landfill costs are super cheap. Manufacturer take back programs are challenging. A lot of the current building stock isn't designed for disassembly, and so some of it's just garbage. Depending where you are in the country, there's variations in recycling and diversion options. And again, as Rand said, there's a cultural stigma valuing new over reuse. Next slide, please. Collaboration needs to happen from everybody at the table to make this work. There's no one party that is going to be the one to facilitate and make this happen. It's a all hands on deck type of situation. Next slide, please. Yeah, so for reuse people, the Inflation Reduction Act has quite a bit of money out there for programs to reduce embodied greenhouse gas emissions associated with construction materials and products. So a lot of organizations are filling out this RFI to try to get some of this money to reuse. So if you are a practitioner in that field, definitely check this out. Next slide. If you have questions or comments, let me know. This slide deck, the original version of it is on the Build Reuse website, and I do believe that Illinois Green is going to be sharing them. With all that information, I'm going to turn it over to Ann Nicklin to finish us off. Thank you.
Okay, and I think I'm on. I lost internet for a moment there, so hopefully I'm here. Thank you so much, Patty, and thank you, Rand, before Patty. Next slide, please. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to be kind of speedy about all of this because we're low on time. So I'm Ann Nicklin. I'm the Director of Workforce Training and Deconstruction Services here at the Rebuilding Exchange. If you can go 2 slides ahead, Twyla. So we are a collaboration of 2 organizations that came together 2 years ago. So you might have known the Evanston Rebuilding Warehouse in Evanston or the Rebuilding Exchange in Chicago. 2 years ago, we came together and became one super organization. So at this point, we are the Rebuilding Exchange with a warehouse in Evanston, a warehouse in Chicago, trucks all over the place, a deconstruction crew, and all sorts of things happening. So we've got about 50,000 square feet of donated materials. And we are at this point one of the largest workforce training providers in the city. We served 100 people in workforce training last year. Next slide. We do sales, and this is a customer salvage retail warehouse. And so where Rand and Patty are talking about commercial scale, we are very much at a little bit of the commercial scale, but we are very much at the residential scale and at the B2C model. So we deal directly with consumers, but it is actively available. One of the challenges with commercial is that they tend to be kind of pilot projects or special projects to the side. We deal in reuse every day, day in, day out. So we have the 2 salvage warehouses. We have our deconstruction crew, which is made up entirely of our workforce trainees. Those are transitional employees that are with us for 5 months, individuals who have barriers to employment, looking to get into the building trades. And then we also have educational seminars. Next slide, please. A little bit about what we've got. Some of it is the beautiful reuse that everybody pays attention to, the stained glass. Next slide, please. Some of it is just honestly more, mundane. Microwaves, appliances, dishwashers. Those are the things that are actually our highest sales point in Evanston. A lot of lumber. People love the big lumber. They don't buy it as often, but we do get a lot of that big lumber and talking about old growth. I think there's room here for a much larger conversation about carbon. I think it would actually be really interesting to have kind of a salon discussion about the IPCC report that came out and talk about embodied carbon, because both Patty and Rand have mentioned it. And it is a huge deal, particularly when we're talking about wood. It really is an absolutely enormous deal, and is the climate change that we can prevent right now. But lumber, we have old growth, and then we have things like light shades, right? Simple stuff. Next slide, please. A little bit about deconstruction. Patty talked about it quite extensively. The deconstruction that we engage in can happen at all scales. Sometimes it's taking down a whole building. Other times it's taking down all the interiors. So we're really working with whatever the opportunity is. But for us, it's as part of a social enterprise. So we are charging people for the deconstruction services because frankly, you get a service for it. And then those materials are donated to us. So there is a savings on tip fees, and that you're not paying for tip fees. But at the end of the day, it's a different deliverable. I hesitate to get into those comparisons, right? Those Best Buy comparisons of like, show us the flyer that has it cheaper. We're never going to win on deconstruction being cheaper because it's a different deliverable. You get a different good. You're paying for people rather than tonnage. You're paying for time. You're getting actual goods out of it instead of crushed up materials. Next slide, please. This is our decon crew. We have a lot of fun, in all honesty. Next slide, please. Educational workshops, talking a little bit about that. If anybody's in the Logan Square neighborhood this weekend, we've got our education folks out there recruiting volunteers in Logan Square. And there's another one coming up, Young Evanston Artists. You can see that on the right-hand side there, a lot of string art. If you like to watch small children hammer things, that's the place for you. But a lot of this is about how do we kind of change the world, right? When people talk about recycling, one of the great things that the recycling folks did is they went into kindergarten classes and they started talking to kindergartners about recycling and about how important it was. And so I remember going home and yelling at my dad and saying, why aren't we recycling? Why aren't we doing this? We have to put a recycling bin out. And you make children your little advocates. And so we are doing that as well. You know, we have a woodshop class for middle schoolers, partly so that we can kind of share the skills, but also so that we can really get out there and build the widespread advocacy that we need that is going to reuse things, that's going to keep things in current use. Next slide, please. A little bit about workforce training, and I know that we're tight on time, so I am going to go ahead and next slide to get to some of my case studies here. If you want to know more about our transitional employment, I can talk about it until the cows come home. We have transitional employment. Next slide, please. We're part of a Snap to Success employment and training program. And we also just recently launched a pre-apprenticeship program last year. So we served 70 people last year. We're going to serve another 70 in pre-apprenticeship this year. There is a huge change going on right now in the state of Illinois, as well as just honestly in the federal situation as well, to really radically change the representation of people of color and women in the construction trades in the state. And it's happening, and it's quite cool, and we're part of that. So reuse is being used as a catalyst to help move this forward. Next slide, please. A little bit about our theory of change. I'm going to skip that, too texty, but once you get the slides, take a look. We're trying to change the world in a lot of different ways here. So these are 3 case studies of different materials that we've brought through that I think are interesting from both a design and a construction perspective. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is a house that was owned by the YWCA here in Evanston. They had used it as administrative offices and at one time as dorms, but finally they had raised actually an enormous amount of money to do a big capital project and bring everything together under a single roof. Part of that project was taking this house down. And originally they had hoped to deconstruct the entire thing. They ultimately actually got an influx of money and like a weird combination of schedule things and couldn't deconstruct the entire building. They had to push their schedule forward too quickly. But it was one of those odd things where we had done all of the plaster. That's kind of the first step on a decon of a building that's, pre-1950, is taking out all the plaster and frequently with lath behind it. And so we'd done all the really awful work, the really dusty, disgusting, terrible work. We'd also gotten the wood floors, which are nice. We've gotten a lot of the finishes, but we hadn't gotten into the structural lumber, which is actually where the true value of a residential home is. Next slide, please. But we had a ton of wooden lath. And so we had a project where a local bakery, Hune, which was actually named, it's opened by a woman who used to be a preservationist. And she named it Hune because she had such a crush on an ads that she worked with to make hand cut lath when she worked in Minnesota. So this is kind of a full circle thing, opening up a new branch of her bakery. It's an all whole grain bakery. It's really neat. It's in Evanston. It's beautiful. And they wanted to incorporate reclaimed materials. They'd always had reclaimed materials be a big part of what they did. And we came up with this cool project to process all this lath and turn it into the counter skirting. Next slide, please, for their new bakery. So we laminated the lath together, ripped it down, and created a little fingerboard jig, which was my fun little chance to do that, and did this whole project. This is actually what we were doing in this is March of 2020. So basically everything shut down and we lost all of our deconstruction projects, and Hune Bakery came through with this project and we were able to keep running our training program by doing this. Next slide, please. And, oh, I didn't even realize that was a little video, blew up video. Good stuff. Next slide, please. Super local project. So Hune is on Central Street in Evanston. We took down the lath in Evanston and then we processed it in Evanston. So kind of a perfect little circular economy. Next slide, please. And you can see on the bottom right-hand side, that counter skirting, some of it's tile, but then you can see some of it in like their commercial pictures is actually our material, glued up together and made to kind of represent what can look beautiful. Next slide, please. All right, so people see that a lot, right? They see the kind of the beautiful restaurant where you get instant patina, you get instant authenticity by having reclaimed materials. But I emphasize that because, honestly, all of us can pull off anything, right? This is one of those great webinars where we're all builders. We all know that everything that we encounter was built by people. And so that means that we can all rebuild it, right? We can take it all down, we can reconstruct it, we can build it again. I very much like Brand's inspiring slide of, this is our world, we can make it better. And so with something like Hune Bakery, I mean, it seems small, but at the end of the day, we can just make whatever decisions we want about design and construction. We have the folks on here to make that work. And so if you have an idea, we can probably make it happen. Next slide, please. This is the Masonic Temple in Wilmette. Again, this was during COVID, so this was actually a great project. It started up in, I think, August 2020. Old Masonic Temple. The entire building was not coming down, but it was instead being converted into condos. So they were going to take that huge auditorium, put a second floor in there, divide it up, and turn the whole thing into condos. And they were highly motivated by the tax benefits of deconstruction. So when you do deconstruction, you pay for the service the same way that you would pay for a demo service, but then you donate the materials to our nonprofit. And that means that's a very significant non-cash donation that you can then count against your taxes. And so in this situation, we were taking out everything that we possibly could. So some of that was really simple, like we took the pool table. Next slide, please. But some of it was more interesting, like the organs. There were 3 organs that came out. Next slide, please. Now we've got Diego playing the organ. There's a better video on the next one, so we'll go next slide. I didn't realize how many videos I had in here. Loading up in front. Next slide, please. All right, so this one, and if you want to hit the button, it's going to start a movie on the right-hand side, Twyla. Oh, or maybe not. Is there there's a good movie on the right-hand side slide. That was the one I was going to go for. There we go. So in this one, we were taking out things like the hardwood floors. So you can see on the left-hand side, taking out all the hardwood floors for that entire auditorium. And it was great. That's, beautiful old maple. But then on the right-hand side, you can see when we were taking out these huge windows, and they were fantastic. They all sold as is. We were able to take them all out. I don't think we actually broke any of them. It was a good excuse to buy an 18-foot double-sided ladder, which was a fun investment. And I'm now happy that I own, though it is enormous. But it was a really cool project. We were doing this actually during the snow. This project kept going through, I think, December of 2020. But if somebody makes the time and makes the opportunity available, we really can do just about anything, right? And all of these projects, there's somebody who wants to reuse these materials. Some of them are very straightforward. Wood floors are very, very easy. Decorative windows, a little bit more challenging, but there's always a buyer for it. Next slide, please. All right, and then finally, this is our house. So this is actually the reuse that I'm most proud of. I've been in reuse for a really long time, and I think that we can absolutely reuse just about everything, and I particularly love the ugly stuff. Next slide. So we moved into a new warehouse. We signed the lease in February 2020, moving from 13,000 square feet on Dempster to 26,000 square feet just around the corner on Hartree Avenue. And so signed the lease. It was a building that had been, well, the whole building is a huge old Montgomery Ward transfer station. But what happened then is we were renting 26,000 square feet that had previously been used to re-roll tape. So these people had bought off-good tape from like 3M and those kind of manufacturers, and then they would re-roll it into dollar store tape. And so it was, you know, they've been here for 40 years, nothing had been touched, carpet everywhere, and then ceiling tile everywhere, fiberglass 2x4 ceiling tile everywhere. And so we took it all, and I didn't quite know what was going to happen. Next slide, please. But it was just too much to throw away. I couldn't bear the idea of ordering 30-yard dumpsters to just toss them. And so we took it all down and we vacuumed it. You can see in these slides, these are a few of the like kind of easier reuse that we did. Top left is a crate of glass that we found. Someplace in the 40 years that the people had occupied this building, they left behind a bunch of glass. And on the right-hand side, you can see that we used it to make some clear story windows. Bottom left is one of the doors from that Masonic temple renovation. We used that to make a window cover to block out some of the sound from our wood shop. Next slide, please. All right, and then this is a little bit of reuse, just reusing sinks, doors, leftover wallpaper we reused. Next slide, please. And I'll talk about all of this in a bit more detail for any of you who are going to be here this afternoon. This is the one that I love though. So we took that 26,000 square feet of ceiling tile, which probably would have been, I mean, it was about 15 pallets of ceiling tile. So we would have gone through at least 3 dumpsters. Instead, we brushed it all off and we changed the way that we were specifying our drywall walls, our chipboard walls, to 24 inches on center rather than 16 inches on center. We had to change the gauge of the steel studs to be a little bit thicker, but not much. And then we stuffed all of our walls with our insulation. So rather than paying for the cost of new insulation, we paid for labor to cut and install all of those 2x4 panels and insulate all of our walls, which has frankly been kind of amazing because we probably wouldn't have paid for insulation otherwise. And to pay for the cost of cutting it down to size, I think in total it was like maybe $3,500. It was far less than we would have paid for insulation. So this is totally invisible now. You can't see it, but it's been astonishing. That's my favorite reuse ever. And I hope that we can continue to do quite a bit more of that. I love seeing that Patty is doing it on a project, you know, just right in the same size or right in the same site. This is where the opportunities lie. Next slide, please. All right, that's me. Hopefully we have enough time left for Q&A. I tried to go very quickly with lots and lots of slides.
All right, thank you, Ann. And then if anyone's interested in seeing the Evanston Rebuilding Exchange tonight, as Ann mentioned, you know, come to the happy hour. You can come see it in person. It is going to be a great time. Drinks are going to be provided. We're still, so it's going to be $10 for a ticket if you have not signed up already. We have been receiving a lot of questions for the Q&A, and we're not going to get through them all, unfortunately. Some have already been answered by the panelists, but yeah, if you're interested in getting a question answered, another reason to come back down to the happy hour in Evanston tonight. To start, one of the questions Patty already answered, but I thought it would be a great one to maybe Rand and Ann to get their opinion on. What are some ways you've been successful in changing the narrative of new is better with the conversation with the clients?
You know, I can say, at least for me, I'm sure Rand has a more commercial exposure to this. For me, the new is better conversation is honestly kind of easy to poke a hole in because it so rarely is. I talk about it more as different. The older growth wood is not better, it's just really different. So I like to really just focus folks not on comparing this versus that. It's more about understanding what it is that you're choosing and understanding the full scope of it. When you're talking about old growth, it's not better wood, it's just really, really different. But when you start talking to people about what embodied carbon is and that it literally is in this piece of wood, or talking about how it was cut down and talking about, you know, kind of the debt that we owe to the Great North Woods, then it becomes a very different conversation and people start to see that their choices carry historical value, that they carry social value. But I don't think that we can ever win the conversation by having these like side-by-side Coke versus Pepsi conversations, because the materials are all really different. The choices are all really different. The schedule and the money is all very different. And so, yeah, I don't think it'll be one in like a foot race. I think this is about, you know, 2 different events at the Olympics.
Yeah, so I'll offer that it doesn't really become a difficult conversation when we're working on something that's sort of a feature to the design. You know, in materials, often it's, as Anne's saying, it's wood or some material that has a special quality that we want to build into the design. We're a big firm, so we also try to get into conversations like furniture reuse. And sometimes that's not a small amount of furniture, it's a lot of furniture. And in those instances, we do get into a little bit of pushback because people do see refurbished, or some people do see refurbished materials and furniture as being somehow different. Many of the manufacturers have refurbished programs. So leaning into them and having them come and say, you know, it's really kind of the same thing. It's just a better price point and you're reusing it, helps. But it doesn't win all the time. You know, there are instances where people really just do want new stuff. And, you know, we try, but we don't win every instance.
Awesome, thank you. Another question for Anne. Does the Rebuilding Exchange resell or repurpose all reclaimed materials and source facilities, or do you partner with anyone?
I mean, everything that we sell here is a donation. The only thing that isn't donated is the wood that we get through Oregon Wood Products. They cut down trees and mill them into new boards. But everything that we receive is a donation. We aren't able to accept everything that people want to give us. We are totally limited by what people are willing to reuse. There are many things out there that are very, very reusable, but nobody's willing to do it. So if you look at solid core doors, there are a lot of solid core doors in this world. And I would imagine that a lot of people on this call are responsible for specifying a lot of solid core doors. Almost nobody is willing to reuse them. There are some folks, you know, with Doors Unlimited, there are a lot of folks who are doing really wonderful things with doors and making it a lot easier to reuse them, but we can't accept them unless somebody's willing to buy it. Otherwise, we just become like a really well-organized landfill. So we reuse everything that we can, and we are basically a pathway for relatively small scale purchasing. You know, I think companies, I saw Stewart's on here from Repley, a lot of these things, and, you know, Patty talked a lot about the material exchanges. Scale is an ongoing challenge, and it's going to have to be an everything at once kind of piece. So we try to do it in our small space of it, but we're all going to have to do it at the same time. It's not going to be like, it's not like the problem's going to be solved and then you get to opt in. We're all going to get a little messy here for the next forever as we get into the circular economy.
And then to squeeze one last question in, combining two questions here. Are there any good resources or references for structural components that have been built for assembly? And then do we have the technologies and skills to capture materials from demolitions, such as concrete mixed with timber and a bunch of different materials? And then how do you make sure they're sound on a large scale?
I would just say that I think either Building Ease in partnership with, I think, like the Boston Carbon Leadership I can't talk, but anyways, this ELF in Boston, that they've been working on a detail hackathon for deconstruction. It's important to note that a lot of what we're taking apart right now was not designed for deconstruction, and so you're having to cut those welds off. However, people are thinking about designing for deconstruction now, and those resources, you know, are going to be available through CAD drawings and BIM models and so forth. And I think maybe Anne or Rand might have more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that BIM, we're all following the lead of the UK. You know, Rand talked a lot about what's happening in London, but UK, what's happening there with the requirements of everything being on BIM, that's basically going to be our future catalog that we order from, right? In terms of structural steel models, Mark Borgolewski, who's up at Ryerson University, has done some really wonderful research on validating the structural capacity of steel using X-rays and sonar and that kind of stuff. It's really reusable. It's just trying to get the steel industry to do something other than new is really difficult. They only do really high-end steel brand new and really low-end steel scrap. But there's a lot of room in the middle and there's a lot of money in the middle. And so if you have a project that is willing to do it, it's totally there. There's a lot of steel in the world and it's not that hard to deconstruct it. It might not be undoable. You might just cut a weld, but if you got a 40-foot beam and you're cutting one weld, that's not a big loss. And structurally, you're not changing the weld at all. You're not changing the beam.
I've got nothing really to add to that.
Okay. It is 1:02. We have more questions, but no, I guess I said, if you're excited to or interested in what the conversation we're having, come by the Evanston Rebuilding warehouse tonight. We'll have a little bit of drinks, or as for those who don't drink, we'll have some cider and juice. But you can really get their opinions on everything. Ask all the questions you want.
Yeah.
We really thank everyone else for coming tonight. It's been a lot of fun. We've been really excited about putting together this panel. Everyone's been trying really hard, to bring in their different perspectives to this very unique, the rebuilding reuse circular economy. And we're very excited how excited everyone has been showing in the comments for bringing forward everything we've been talking about now.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of this, and hopefully we can address some of the unanswered questions in a Q&A document. And yeah, if you signed up for our tour later, we'll be there at 4:30 to walk around Rebuilding Exchange Evanston with you. Everybody have a good day. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, speakers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.